The Electoral Commission says that it is ready to welcome more than 200 local and international delegates who will be converging at the Cape Town International Convention Centre for the next 3 days as part of the Electronic Voting for South Africa conference. Now, this conference will serve as a pivotal platform for initiating a public conversation about the possibility of introducing e-voting in South Africa sometime in the future. But to tell us more about what is envisaged, we are joined by the IEC Chairperson, Mosotho Moepya. Mr. Moepya, always a pleasure having you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good to be here. Thank you, Sakina, and thank you to your viewers.
Now, Mr. Moepya, e-voting in South Africa, just give us some background about the electronic voting conference coming up for the IEC. And, of course, what is the thinking of the IEC in this regard?
Sakina, you will recall that in 2013, we hosted an international e-voting conference in South Africa. It was here in Cape Town. At that point, we had looked at the entire world to say who in the world is using electronic voting and what type of electronic voting is that. And we found that there were indeed countries that were using it and using it successfully. That there were also countries that were using it and had stopped using it. And that there were countries interested in using e-voting, but were very cautious because of some doing it and some not doing it. At that point, South Africa said, we are happy with our manual way of voting. We are keen to know what the world is doing, but we do not believe we are ready to go there. And so 10 years later, almost 12 years later, we are back here. We have done a similar research. We have brought in countries that have used it, countries that have stopped using it, and countries that are looking at it. And we are saying, on a more serious note, what do South Africans also say about it? In other words, we have commissioned a research piece of work which will be delivered today. The research will be unveiled. It will tell us what South Africans are saying, and then we will take the view South Africans hold, what we have learned from our other jurisdictions in the world, and we'll begin to have a conversation with everyone. There are two purposes that we do this for. One is so that we all understand the basis from which we depart in this discussion, that we have a common basis. We understand e-voting as you and I would understand it when we have a discussion. But this is a discussion we have with the rest of the country. The second thing, and it's important, is that we are not reacting to perhaps a local government election that is coming in 2026. We know that there is a lead time that must be taken to appreciate, to have a discussion, and to settle e-voting, as it were, in our country. So we are not doing this with 2026 in mind.
And interestingly, Mr. Moepya, you say that you will hear, among others, from countries who are using it, but also countries who have stopped using e-voting. That should be rather interesting, in terms of the pros and the cons of e-voting.
It is indeed, and that's why we think it is best for South Africans to hear both sides of the story, and to really appreciate what are some of the drivers that have led to the implementation of e-voting, and what are some of the drivers that have led to that implementation being discontinued.
And in a country like South Africa, one would imagine that public trust is a major factor here, because if the trust deficit is too wide, then I would imagine that right off the bat would scupper this.
Well, South Africa is one of those countries that, in elections, the trust element is very, very low. So you have to, as an electoral management body, you have to engender that trust. You can't work on the basis that everybody trusts. But I think that's a lesser problem. If we understand the the many options that electronic voting can bring for us. For example, there are many technologies that are used at voting stations. In those technologies, you simply don't print a ballot. You bring an equipment, everyone comes to the station, they make their choice on that machine. They may even print a receipt type proof of their choice. And then, the system will automatically record. They may even deposit their printed copy into a ballot box for us to compare the printed copy with the electronic copy. We have seen that in Venezuela and in other countries. That's the one side. The other side, it's a little more advanced in that it's where people can use the World Wide Web, the internet as we call it, to vote from where they are using platforms that they have, whether it's an iPad, a phone, or anything, a workstation, to then vote. Those are a little more difficult for a country and a terrain like ours. But I'm not preempting any one of them. I think let's have a discussion, because all of this will be on show and there will be people dealing with their pros and cons and the greatest benefits that they have reaped from doing it.
As things stand right now, Mr. Moepya, do our electoral laws support e-voting?
There is a part of our laws that have already made it possible for one to present themselves not only in person, but to do it online. For example, registration as a voter and submitting lists of candidates as a candidate. We are already doing it online. The only part we are not doing at the moment is voting itself and counting the ballots electronically. And I imagine that those are the two areas of the work that we do that may receive a heightened amount of tension in these discussions.
So looking at, what this would lend itself to, you spoke about, the accessibility factor, and maybe this is something that still needs to be looked at. And in that regard, would we be looking perhaps also at a model that would make provision for both e-voting and manual voting at the same time?
I think whatever choices we make in our country, we are, for a period of time at least, are likely to be doing both. I don't think it's going to be a stop-start, and I may be very wrong, Sakina, and I don't want viewers to say, we heard him say we're going to be running both, or we're going to do a stop-start. But I imagine that technology must be tested. India took over 20 years to transition from the one to the other. And in that over 20 years, they really worked the two things side by side. We know that Brazil has taken almost 16 years themselves to do this. There are many examples I could be counting. But one must also say the DRC in 2023 simply leaped from a manual process to an electronic process. What their drivers were, we don't know. They will be here. South Africans that want to hear what they have to say are welcome, because they will explain, what their pressures were, what their issues were, and whether the implementation is considered successful by their voters in their country. We know that South Africans would want us to implement something that is tried and tested, and we are under no illusion that we are going to have a free pass there.
And just finally, I'm just looking at some of the responses already coming through, because we're running this as our question of the day with regard to South Africa and e-voting, Mr. Moepya. And people are very concerned about the fact that they think that the vote may be stolen. They are quite concerned about cyber security risks and also fraud prevention. So just in terms of that, I would imagine that independent oversight would then become key, just to make sure that everything is what it should be and ensure the credibility of the results. So in that regard, are you able just to elucidate the sort of discussions that you've heard previously at previous conferences in this regard?
Yes, quite an important question and a valid concern. Cybersecurity is always a risk in elections, including the elections that we had in 2024. We are not immune from cybersecurity, even though we vote on paper, we capture the results at a municipal electoral office and then transmit them. There is a great amount of risk. But what we have done, we have invested significantly, not in one form of security, but in a combination of many forms of security to deal or to mitigate any risks of cybersecurity. And touch wood, we have not had any successful attempts. Yes, we have had many attempts at it, but nothing successful. When you do something like this, there are many opportunities and measures that are already proven that are in place that one can use. Clearly, we would have to look at that. But I must also indicate that the greatest of this kind of risks is when anyone uses the World Wide Web anywhere in the world to vote in an election, because there you now have to not only contend with where there is the internet and where there is no internet. You also have to worry about person's vote actually reaching you or not reaching you. And so that is an area we ask South Africans to talk about very carefully. But I can assure you, when people say this is what we like, our job doesn't just then say, okay, because you like this, you have it. Our job is going to be to educate. It's going to be one that proves that the chosen method actually serves South Africans in the best interest possible, that it is the best way of getting South Africans to vote. We are simply not going to implement for the sake of implementing.
Right, I'll touch wood on your behalf. And that is, of course, the IEC Chairperson, Mr. Mosotho Moepya, talking to us about the importance of starting a dialogue on electronic voting and a 3-day conference that's being held in Cape Town in the Western Cape. And it's our question of the day, so let us know your thoughts on that. Quick break, and then we'll have your newspaper headlines for you.